Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Zach Shurab-Conti, and I'm a Turing Research Fellow at the Alan Turing Institute in London. Today, I would like to talk to you about energy modeling and forecasting for an underground agricultural farm in South London. So this research was done together with the Energy Efficient Cities Initiative Group at the University of Cambridge, led by Professor Ruchi Chowdhury, and forms part also of a greater research project known as the Crop Research Observation Platform Digital Twins, also known as CROP DT. And this was in collaboration with Growing Underground, previously operated by Zero Carbon Farms Limited. So CROP is a digital twin for a previously operational underground farm situated 33 meters below underground in South London. The underground farm is situated in a retrofitted underground tunnel on the Northern Line, previously used as a shelter during the Blitz in World War I. The main farm tunnel is composed of two shelving stacks along either side. Each bench is equipped with LED lighting, which are switched on and off daily to mimic a diurnal sunlight cycle. The tunnels are also ventilated manually by controlled fans. So this farm is equipped with a sensor network that forms part of a digital twin infrastructure, and whose main goal is to monitor and forecast the environmental real-time conditions in the underground farm. And this facilitates the crop growers with insight to interpret and control the environment, which will ultimately maintain a steady crop growth. So that is their main goal. The main goal here is for the farmers to maintain a steady crop growth and thus meet their promised crop yield to the suppliers. So as I said earlier, given that this is a retrofitted tunnel, this can sort of be a difficult task, a challenging task to do without any sort of information about the environment in current situation, also in future. So the on-site sensors in this infrastructure feed into an Azure-based infrastructure where real-time time series data for temperature and relative humidity are stored in a database and eventually used to visualize the real-time conditions in a web application, and also are fed to a suite of forecasting models. So the digital twin can be interacted with via this web-based interface that displays the current and predicted future conditions via these so-called forecasting models. Now, in the study, we focus on three temperature and relative humidity sensors that are located at the center of the farm tunnel. Specifically, these are located at the top bench, the middle bench, and the bottom bench of this specific location in the tunnel. So we can see on the right-hand side, the periodic nature of both temperature and relative humidity is influenced heavily by the schedule of the lighting. That, as I said earlier, is set to mimic the diurnal solar exposure to regular crops. Now, to be more specific, we look at something called the vapor pressure deficit, also known as VPD, which allows crop growers to gauge the impact of humidity on plant growth and development. So VPD can be described intuitively as sort of the remaining capacity for more humidity in the air at a given temperature. The VPD can be calculated by subtracting the water vapor pressure in the air from the saturated vapor pressure at specific temperature. So the challenge with modeling and forecasting for sensed environments, such as this retrofitted tunnel, is that the spectral complexity of the observed signals is of an order larger than the spatial complexity. So in other words, the number of sensor locations is not enough to reveal the broad range of frequencies and growth rates governing the dynamics underlying the observed data. And this is because we have a sparse network. So this is especially the case when the governing dynamics experience external forcings or noisy signals, such as in this case, the weather, human operation, and so on. So our approach here is to adopt a spectral decomposition approach to identify and interpret a structure that governs the underlying dynamics of the observed environment. So we want to identify consistent structure that we can see consistently across different time periods throughout the year. within this farm environment. And so once we obtain these, so the goal here is to obtain this structure in a Fourier-like fashion through the identification of governing Fourier-like modes. Once we have identified these governing modes, we can then assemble a simplified yet physically interpretable model for forecasting purposes. And this sort of type of simplified but yet interpretable model is very desirable on board, for example, controllers for such environments, for controlling such systems. So we achieve this by looking at high order dynamic mode decomposition. And so high order dynamic mode decomposition is an extension of a method called dynamic mode decomposition, and also known as DMD. So DMD is a data-driven reduced order modeling technique that attempts to recover the governing dynamics directly from time series data. Now, the main principle here of classic DMD is to learn a linear matrix operator A, so the matrix operator A, which essentially advances the states from one time step to the next. In dynamical systems, this task is also referred to as system identification. And this operator that we recover contains the approximated dynamical information about the system underlying data. Now, in DMD, the data is first organized as a set of so-called snapshots, which are observed instances at equally spaced points in time, and stored as a matrix of row vectors whose columns represent snapshots of the measured system. A consecutive snapshots matrix is formulated by offsetting the matrix by one time step, and this is referred to as the time-delayed matrix. Subsequently, spatiotemporal data is decomposed as an expansion of Fourier-like modes by performing singular value decomposition on the snapshot matrix, where each mode is weighted by an amplitude and grows or decays in time by a growth rate and oscillates with a frequency. So HODMD extension can be interpreted as the classical DMD algorithm described above, but applied in a sort of time-delayed sliding window approach based on Taken's delay embedding theorem approach, where HODMD relates D timed delayed snapshots, and where D is a tunable parameter or hyperparameter that we have to calibrate manually. So while there is no strict rule of thumb for selecting D, the value of D from experimentation and also from literature scales with the order of the dynamics and also with the number of snapshots used for fitting. So for the study, we'll look at three different environmental scenarios. The first is a typical scenario in January 2022, where the environment of the farm was undergoing typical conditions. That is, that the environment was not undergoing any extraordinary external forcings. So from HODMD, we are able to decompose a number of 255 modes that supposedly compose this signal. Now, from these modes were ranked in order of integral contribution. And sort of through a manual sensitivity study, we're able to identify which an elbow point at which the selection of modes no longer has a sensitivity on reconstruction of the signal. So from just these three eigenpairs, from these three mode pairs, we are able to reconstruct the signal quite well, so capture the governing structure quite well, and also using just these three modes, forecast for 3 days ahead, as can be seen in the bottom plot. So the very far plot on the right-hand side shows the stability of the selected modes, and as you can see, they lie on the unit circle, and also they have mostly real parts. Now, the cool thing is that we are able to interpret what these modes mean. And from the frequency, for example, on the bottom one, for what we are calling the mode associated with the weather influence, the frequency of that mode corresponds with the frequency of the ambient temperature time series. Whereas, for example, the lighting influence frequency mode, the frequency of the light influence mode corresponds with the frequency of the lighting schedule. And so the remaining dynamics, the remaining mode, we attribute to sort of the remaining farm dynamics. And we were able to also see these same modes across in the three scenarios. So for the second scenario, and this is for May, also a scenario undergoing typical conditions, but of course a different time of the year. So we wanted to sort of observe whether we can identify these corresponding structures also in a different season. So we can also identify the same modes by their frequencies that are also present in this. And so also using simply these 6 modes or these 3 modes pairs, we're able to reconstruct the signal quite well and also forecast for 3 days ahead. So in the third scenario, this is sort of a scenario in July where conditions were atypical, which means that as can be seen from the time series, that is much more noisy, yet still showing periodic behavior. There is transient behavior that is sort of being influenced, that is occurring due to external forcings from the environment. During this period, there happened to be a heat wave in London. And this can be seen obviously again in the time series. So we wanted to see whether we can actually infer and identify the same corresponding modes in this scenario. And we can do that. We can see that mode A, B, C, and D correspond very close to the same modes with the same frequencies identified in scenarios A and B. Yet, because of the transient behavior, we require many more modes to capture the governing dynamics of this. And this is, again, mainly attributed to the transient nature of the signal, given the circumstances that the form was undergoing. And we can see that we can see that the farm dynamics and the lighting schedule sort of modes are persistent, and the remaining modes that required, the additional modes that were required to describe the signal were actually attributed to the weather. And this we can say by noting that the modes E to L correspond mostly with almost the mean lie at the mean frequency. So we can attribute modes E to L as being related to the weather, which kind of makes sense given that we know that this noisy signal is attributed towards the heat wave. So when we compare side by side across all 3 scenarios, we can see again that the modes all correspond and are the same modes that we see, and we can say that by looking at their frequency in the bottom plot. Obviously, their amplitudes vary, but the frequencies remain the same. So this shows a nice robustness of this sort of structure that we've identified here, and we can sort of we can come to a conclusion that this potentially could be these could be governing modes in this form, and will allow us to build compact forecasting models for controllers and for other applications. In the top plot is selected 6 modes based on their integral contribution, whereas in the bottom plot we're plotting all the modes. So this is reconstruction given all the modes. And as you can see, the main difference is that obviously the reconstruction using 6 modes and forecast is much smoother, yet the structure of this time series is captured. And so we don't need all the modes, especially for control purposes such as this. Furthermore, we can even implement stability. We can even select modes by their stability. And that is by how far away they are from the unit circle. If eliminated, it can actually have a positive influence on the reconstruction and stability of the forecast. And this can be seen. So these are the modes. On the left-hand side is all the modes, on the right-hand side are without the modes that are lying outside the unit circle. So we can notice this difference, in fact, when we compare the forecast with all the modes and forecast with just the stable modes. And as you can see, there's a much closer match on the bottom one that corresponds with with a stabilized model. So there are 3 main takeaways I'd like to just communicate and end with. So firstly, dominant mode selection. The modes with low amplitudes also shown to be dominant. So typically when selecting modes, they're typically ranked by their amplitude, but it turns out that some lower amplitudes tend to also be contributing. Hence why we go with integral contribution. The dominant modes were observed across periodic and transit scenarios, and we perhaps can argue that, like as we said, these modes could be the governing and characteristic modes for this form. So second point is model robustness versus fit. So why the reconstruction and forecast of scenario C did not appear to be successful by traditional fitting standards, we find value in the stability of the forecast. So even though the reconstruction was coarse, we care about stability. So when we compare this with a typical linear regression model a RIMA model that we were using previously for forecasting, the RIMA model exploded when it came to scenario C. Whereas in terms of this model, because we are capturing the governing structure, the model might have been coarse as in fitting standards, but was stable. And lastly, we also observed that the system's eigenvalues tend towards stability, such as in scenarios A and B. And in these scenarios, we were able to forecast for much longer periods. So trying to capture a stable eigenmodes could be a way of ensuring that we have a stable model and can also forecast longer periods. Thank you very much for your attention, and I welcome any questions.